it looks like after 5 years, Sonic Team is still just as confused as ever as to how to properly take the series in a new direction that the series desperately needs, and that's really upsetting.
I am so happy to be wrong about that one.
Sonic Frontiers had a lot to prove to me. I've been a fan of this Blue Boy for years, but to say that my relationship with the series has been a little bit strained would be an understatement. It's no secret that the Blue Boy's reputation throughout the history of the series has been soured plenty of times, but it's been even more apparent in the past few years. And for me personally, I've seen less and less of what I initially loved about the series in recent entries. So Frontiers needed to be the game to win that goodwill back. And part of the reason why I ended up loving Frontiers as much as I did was not only because it leans into what I loved about the series in the first place, but for the first time in what feels like forever, it feels like the series has carved a new direction forward that finally feels sustainable and a promising formula for future entries in the series. In order to properly explain why this game impressed me as much as it did, I wanted to take a look back at some of the series' history in order to understand why and how issues I've had with it became series mainstays for so long. And while Frontiers isn't perfect, I'll be going over how well it does and doesn't course correct from those issues in order to highlight how Frontiers ultimately validated my love for the series. So if you have nothing better to do than to watch a guy rant and rave about a blue hedgehog for however long this video ends up being, stick around because we've got a lot of ground to cover to see how Sonic fared in this new Frontier. That was so stupid. Why did I write that? The year is 2011. I just played Sonic Generations for the first time, and my middle school self entered a Sonic phase that he honestly never recovered from. From that point on, I went out of my way to play every single game that I could, and got to the point where I now know the lyrics to every single Crush 40 song by heart. To give you perspective on how bad it was, I used to get made fun of in gym class for running with my hands behind my back, thinking that I was like Sonic and that it would make me go faster. I'm not proud of it, but I'm able to admit it now, so that's gotta be some kind of character development. And hey, it could have been worse. I never drew any OCs, so I didn't go as far down as I could. This was a very particular time to be cementing my fate as a terminal Sonic fan for life, because this boy and his reputation has not been the most consistent, to say the least. I'm sure you've heard it all by now. The combination of 06 perceivably dealing permanent damage to the brand at the time, and waves of internet funny men parodying each other while dogpiling on every new release, saying that the series was never good, led to popular public opinion being to rag on the Blue Boy. I mean, this is just my completely unique and original opinion, but Sonic had a rough transition to 3D.
No more.
It's not to say that all of these criticisms were invalid. The series has absolutely had numerous low points of quality and design, with the period of time where games like 06, Shadow the Hedgehog, and the Storybook series being referred to as the dark era of Sonic due to the low critical reception that all these games got at the time of release. And while virtually all of these titles have their own issues, people were saying the games were bad for reasons that were questionable looking back on it now. And these extremely vocal opinions ended up leading to Sonic Team themselves significantly changing aspects of their games over time, especially after the backlash that games like 06 and Unleashed got at the time. Complaints about Sonic's ensemble cast and multiple playstyles of varying qualities led to a refocus on just Sonic's gameplay with very little else. Complaints of the stories taking themselves too seriously and broadening in scope with messy writing led to premises like Colors and Generations that were extremely simple and safe that didn't do anything too unique, with writing that focused on emulating more of a kids show style that lacked much substance beyond characters constantly throwing out quips and progressively becoming more one-dimensional if they were lucky to be granted much screen time at all. These were seen as positive changes around the time that Generations came out, but nowadays many fans, myself included, have ended up missing a lot of aspects from these older titles because part of the series' identity has felt absent from the games for years. Say what you will about the overall quality of most of the games within the Dark Era, but they were doing things that games that played it more safe like Lost World can't even hold a candle to.
Like, bro, they gave Sonic a sword. They gave him a sword. And we were stupid enough to call it cringe? If they did this now, this would be the rawest thing that anyone has ever done, period. And yes, I get that this is a series for children, and that it is absolutely stupid that this dumb blue rodent turns into a magical golden mode for the final boss where he fights against a celestial evil being from another dimension while a heavy metal track plays in the background. But I am not going to sit here and lie to myself saying that the 10-year-old inside of me doesn't think that this is one of the rawest things on the planet. It is stupid, and I'm proud to admit that I love it. But it's this kind of stuff that we started seeing a lot less of as the years went on. And it sucks because you can tell that they abandoned stuff like this to have a lot more of a wide appeal for the series. And that would be one thing if the games that we were getting were still good, but they weren't.
Things were looking up for the future, as it felt like Sonic Team had finally managed to find a winning formula with the boost formula they've been working with since Unleashed Colors and Generations. So what did Sega do when the fancy new hardware of the PS4 and Xbox One showed up for the series to take advantage of? They locked the franchise to the Wii U for 3 whole games and released an unabashed attempt to rip off Mario Galaxy that abandoned the boost style of gameplay for something much slower, another whatever Olympic game, and an attempt at a series reboot that failed so miserably that the only reason it's even remotely looked back upon fondly is because the TV show that released alongside it is decently funny.
Capable is my middle name.
I thought your middle name was The.
Do you think they regretted trusting Nintendo with the Wii U? I've replayed Generations alongside other 3D Sonic games more times than I can count, but I always think it's funny to look back on this one line from the end of the game with the hindsight of what came after this.
Hey, Sonic! Enjoy your future! It's gonna be great!
Okay. Let's not act like that everything from this point on was horrible. Even though I don't know what that is, both movies ended up being really good, and Sonic Mania, which released in 2017, was one of the best games in the series. I loved it so much that I speedran it for a little bit, and used to be in the top 10 worldwide in my category before everyone else and their mother started playing it too. Even though it wasn't developed by Sonic Team themselves and was actually helmed by fan developers, it was such a good time and is easily one of the best games in the series. So it only makes sense for Sonic Team to follow it up in the same year with one of the most bland, uninspired, and unambitious games in the series. Forces is one of those games that I've blocked from my memory because the more I think about it, the more I get upset that it exists. And it's such a weird title because while other games in the series are way more unpolished than this one, I still think that this is the worst one by far.
There is a lot to dislike about Forces. From the incessant over-reliance of nostalgia between classic Sonic coming back, the reuse of level themes like Green Hill and Chemical Plant, which we've seen in almost every single game since Generations, instead of actual new level aesthetics and environments, the false advertisings of characters like Chaos being important to the plot, incredibly short levels that have so little going on in them that you can literally beat some of them with barely any interaction, and a plot that tries to incorporate serious beats but ends up making me feel nothing, with the writing getting to obnoxious levels of character assassination and quippiness.
It's been generations since I seen you. You okay?
Other Sonic games before Forces may have had rougher edges that didn't always work out well, but I'd argue that every single game before that one could be complimented for at least something interesting it had going for it. Forces is the epitome of a stale cracker game, and after fans got burned by it yet again, it more than anything else showed that things needed to change. Fast forward 5 years later to this past summer, when about after a year of theorizing on what the next game would be like, we finally got our first look at what Frontiers is going to have in store. Expectations were high given the little information that we knew at the time, leading many to believe that this would truly be a new step forward for the series, given that the game was ditching the linear formats of the past entries and following the industry trend of going bigger and better in expansive explorable areas, which genuinely sounded really promising, as Sonic as a character feels built to be able to make traversing across large areas fun with how fast and flashy you can move around. And then we got a textbook definition of one of the worst ways you could have ever shut off your game for the first time. I don't know who decided that it was a great idea to show 8 minutes of no context footage of an unfinished build of the game, but this wasn't doing the game any favors, and it sent fans into panic mode yet again. It painted the game in such a bad light that it caused me and so many other fans to immediately become skeptical, calling for the game to get delayed, to which Sega surprisingly stood firm confirmed, saying that the game was still coming out in 2022.
Sega continued to be seclusive of what they decided to show after that, and fans were so starved for info that we were legit deciphering footage from an off-camera video feed from Summer Games Fest of someone playing it in the corner of a video that you can barely even see. Like, why are we like this?
Over time, though, as the game got actual marketing and started getting shown off more, public opinion started to shift. Not only did it look like the game was leaning more and more into the attitude and vibes of the dark era of Sonic with an actual plot, but everyone who got the chance to play the game early was saying that it was fun.
By now, us Sonic fans were in denial. When was the last time that we ever had a positive reception about a game before it came out? Everyone's hopes were on this game finally being the one to win back goodwill for the series, not just for fans, but for the industry at large. And did the game manage to pull it off? Well, let's talk about it. Frontiers differentiates itself from every mainline game that came before it by taking Sonic's gameplay and adapting it to an entirely new open world format. Well, excuse me, open zone format. For some reason, they're really trying their hardest to avoid the Breath of the Wild comparisons. Ever since Unleashed, Sonic games followed a pretty typical formula that many refer to as the boost era. You have a couple of really strong, intricate levels that you can speed through, beat in like 2 or 3 minutes, and levels like that are the core of the game. While the boost formula initially did a great job at creating gameplay that fit Sonic's speed, a problem started to emerge as more games relied on this format. And that's that this boy moves too fast for this to be sustainable. Let's take a look at it from a developer standpoint. These levels have to be huge to accommodate for how quickly Sonic moves throughout them. And not only do they have to be big, but they have to be intricate as well, with alternative paths and obstacles and environmental hazards to interact with. So you have to spend an insane amount of time and resources into developing one level just for players to be able to clear it in like 3 minutes. And while these levels are built to be incredibly replayable, it also means that most boost games either end up being incredibly short, or in specific scenarios, levels can even feel underbaked. And I'm pretty sure it's why we got stuff like Forces. So Frontiers from the get-go is a big deal, because for the first time in a Sonic game, players now have full range to move around freely in an open environment, and while the terminology of open zone may on the surface seem like an attempt to avoid comparison from other games, it starts to make a little bit more sense when you look at the game's framework.
Rather than one seamless open world, the game is composed of several different islands for the players to explore, and it's in this open-ended exploration where the game attempts to bring Sonic's fast movement and gameplay to an entirely new format. This design shakeup naturally meant that Sonic's control and playstyle needed to change significantly, and given that his movement would play such a big factor in my enjoyment of the game, I think Frontiers is really close to what I would have wanted out of this style of gameplay. Frontiers nails Sonic's sense of speed. There's a lot of flexibility for how Sonic controls between the two different styles of gameplay that you're prompted with at the beginning of the game, as well as being able to manually change individual parameters for Sonic's movement as well. I guess maybe they saw one too many clips of games journalists not knowing how to play Sonic, and they decided to try and make things a little bit easier to get into. Sonic can definitely feel a little bit unwieldy at times, and the camera doesn't always want to work with you, causing situations where sometimes you can go a little bit too fast, which can send you careening off into a direction that you didn't intend. But part of the fun is learning and adapting to that speed and eventually taking better control of it, which leads to moments where you have so much fun just moving around.
I'm a simple man. If I see good movement in a video game, the single brain cell inside of me gets a huge dose of serotonin. I mean, just look at this.
The boost itself has also been radically changed. Ever since Unleashed, the mechanic has remained functionally the same. You press the button, Sonic goes and blows through everything in his path. Boost to Win eventually got coined as a way to describe this kind of gameplay, and while it does look and feel cool, it can also kind of feel like a one-stop shop in terms of what the optimal way to move around is. The boost in Frontiers, however, doesn't have invincibility, and instead replenishes much quicker over time, rather than being tied to collecting a specific resource like rings. This makes it feel much more like another tool for Sonic to use, especially given how useful it is for moving quickly in the air. The controls themselves have even been changed significantly from past Sonic games too, with boost wrist having now moved from the X button to the right trigger, and homing attack being mapped to a different button from the jump button as well. While this took a little while to get used to, I actually found that it works really well. Having specific actions like the homing attack not overlap with the jump button anymore gives a greater sense of control that I got so used to that going back to games like Generations felt a little weird by comparison, which is a little wild for me to say. Prior to the game's release, a lot of people were taking issue with how the world design looked jumbled together and not visually cohesive, with grind rails, springs, and other interactables being littered throughout the world without much visual cohesion. But honestly, when you're playing the game, you end up paying a lot more attention to how the environment can help you move around and pull off cool tech with it, and you really don't pay much attention to how it visually fits into the world. That is when they're not popping in right in front of you. Yeah. Popping can get really rough in the open areas, with platforms sometimes not showing up until you're already super close to them, with it being an issue for even me on the PS5. But I believe this is more of an issue with Frontiers releasing on 8 different pieces of the hardware, including the toaster that is the Nintendo Switch, and keeping all of those versions on par with each other, rather than next-gen hardware not being able to properly handle draw distance. But even though it visually doesn't look great, I don't think there are too many times where it actively got in the way of me trying to play the game, though. The world design itself is broken up into many individual platforming challenges scattered throughout, with the reward for many of them being memory tokens that allow the player to progress the story by being able to talk to Sonic's friends that are trapped on the islands. The world designs of the islands themselves are fine. While the concept of an island featuring technology of an abandoned ancient civilization is getting just a tiny bit overplayed in open world games, I still kind of like what they were going for here, even if I do wish the islands themselves look a lot more visually distinct from each other. The islands could have used a lot more noticeable landmarks that would have helped with each one feeling more visually dynamic, and there are a handful of moments where actually exploring them leads to cool discoveries, like on Ares Island where you can find an underground tunnel to go through that leads to a distant area that previously looked hard to get to, or being able to platform across these massive floating rings in the sky. But moments like these are far and few between. Some people have taken issue with how the game still feels a little bit automated, and I know for a fact that I do not want to touch the momentum debate with a 10-foot pole, but I think Frontiers is loose enough with its player freedom that it doesn't put the entire game on autopilot, and proves that you can make Sonic still feel good to move around as, with a level of control that doesn't rely entirely on momentum. One of the ideas that always came up when discussing the idea of a more open Sonic game, though, is creating objectives and reasons to go out and explore. So, what do you actually do in these open zones? The game format for Frontiers generally goes like this. You reach an island, complete a variety of different challenges to eventually get all the Chaos Emeralds to fight a massive Titan, and after beating them, reach a new island and rinse and repeat a few more times. There are definitely plenty of things to grab your attention as you explore each of the main islands, with all of them having different incentives for doing so. The main way that the game handles explorations are mini challenges scattered throughout the world that after completing them will not only fill out your map, but also progressively add grind rails throughout the world to make traversing the islands a little bit more flexible. The actual challenges themselves, though, can be a little bit of a mixed bag. Some can be fun when they actually take advantage of Sonic's kit, like in the time trials where you have to get to a specific area in a short amount of time, but a majority of them are extremely basic puzzles, if you can even call them that, like these ones where you just have to hit a couple of switches or do this extremely basic tile puzzle that keeps showing up. The simplistic nature of many of these challenges makes it easy to look at a lot of these and be like, yeah, whatever, I guess I'll do them. But most of them never end up taking more than a few seconds to clear, so it makes it pretty easy to stop and do them without breaking up your flow of moving throughout the islands too much. Alongside filling out more of the map, Sonic can get items that will let him upgrade his attack and defense. Speaking of which, he can throw hands in this game.
Frontiers' combat is something I was immensely looking forward to, being the character action game stan that I am. Sonic games have tried experimenting with more in-depth combat systems like with the Werehog in the past, but almost never within the context of just playing as Sonic himself. And while this is not Sonic May Cry by any stretch of the imagination, I think it's a great addition to spice up Sonic's general gameplay that could greatly be expanded upon in the future.
While Frontiers' combat is simple, it sets itself above every prior attempt at introducing combat into the series due to it capturing a playstyle that fits Sonic's character, and his wide new ability pool greatly contributes to this. The biggest of which being his new Psyloop ability, where Sonic is able to have a trail of light follow him and close around it to release a gust of attacks. Psyloop is one of the main ways of interacting with most of the game, both when exploring in the open areas and in combat, and I think it fits so well into his moveset that I would be more than okay with it becoming a permanent thing that he can do from now on. Running around enemies while boosting and trying to keep your speed up feels great, and then chaining that into other different attacks always looks flashy.
As someone who grew up watching Super Mario Bros. Z Mario vs. Sonic animations on my iPod Touch in 2008, seeing Sonic pull off similar stuff in this game would have had 7-year-old me foaming at the mouth. And if there's ever another Smash game after Ultimate and Sonic still has the same boring moveset after this game that he's had for over 10 years, Nintendo and I are going to have even more problems.
Sonic has a skill tree which gives him access to new moves, with each having its own individual prompt to execute them. If there's one complaint that I do have though, it's that most of these moves all kind of fall into the same heavy hitter, big flashy attack category that can easily deal massive damage, and while they look raw and feel great to pull off, I do wish there was a little bit more variety and versatility in the kits other than moves that make health bar non-existent. A lot of the enemies and individual bosses throughout the islands also give you opportunities to use Sonic's kit in different ways as well. The tower enemies, for instance, can be whittled down by side looping around them to make them smaller and easier to hit, or you can try to take them out using Sonic's projectile moves as well. The various versions of Ninja are probably my favorite fights in the game though, because they feel like a true skill check for mastering and pulling moves together, dodging and parrying as well.
Sonic also has a Bayonetta witch time where he slows down time after perfect dodging and parrying, which really fits his character, but the parry is a little bit weirder. I actually didn't know that you didn't need to time the parry and you could just hold on to it for it to activate automatically until like the third island. I don't think I'm the only one that's made this mistake because it's explained in a weird way in the tutorial, but I'm also really confused as to why it is this way too. My working theory is that there was a version of the game that had actual timed parries, but there are certain moments in the game later on where it's required to beat certain enemies, and Sega probably thought parrying would be too hard for little 5-year-old Timmy who got the game for his birthday. So they made it easier because of that. Some fights go for more of a spectacle, which can look really sick, like when you see stuff like Squid and Fortress fly throughout the map, then hop onto them at any time to start racing after them. I also like this one little bit when fighting Fortress, when he spins around in this little flip and the camera randomly decides to follow it in like this little spin thing, and it's like, why? It's also hysterical when you're just minding your own business and then Squid decides to go. There are some flops among the bunch though when it comes to the bosses. I hate virtually every single fight that's on Ares Island, especially Tank. And some cinematic boss fights like Shark are cool the first time you fight them, but every time after that, it's just a waiting game of being able to continue the fight. Like, can I hate you yet? No? We're still doing this? On the whole though, I really did like the combat in Frontiers, and I really hope it's something that they choose to expand upon more in future titles. It may not be the most complex combat, but it's always flashy, and that helps it stay engaging throughout the entire game, which is important because fighting bosses is how you get portal gears, which gives you access to the last major portion of the game, that being cyberspace levels. And my feelings on these are a little bit more complicated, so let's get into it. Oh. So, Cyberspace is where the more traditional boost formula-centric gameplay that we've seen in games like Generations and Unleashed takes place. There's about 7 to 8 levels in each island that you can access through the cyber portals, and I got some thoughts about them. We had known about Cyberspace being part of the game before the game came out through not just leaks, but press coverage as well, but we had no idea what shape they were going to take on. Then they were officially revealed, and okay, this is the most lukewarm take on the planet, but I am sick of Green Hill Zone coming back. Part of the reason why Sonic games over the past 10 years have been so creatively bankrupt is their insistent reliance on this one level aesthetic that only keeps coming back purely out of nostalgia baiting. This isn't something new. They've been doing Green Hill, but not Green Hill actually type levels across the entire series. But before 2011, we were still getting unique environments and world designs alongside the nostalgia pandering. That has not been the case recently though. When it first came back in Generations, it was cool, because it was an anniversary celebration game. They even make a quip about it, saying, hey, does this place look a little bit familiar? But that joke doesn't even work in this context anymore because of how much it's overused now. You used it again in Lost World. Oh, but it's called Windy Hill now, so that doesn't count, right? It's in every single spin-off game. It was in Mania. Sonic has 2 stages in Smash Brothers, and they're both Green Hill. And then Enforces, the first big boost game to come out since Generations, which had been 6 years old at that point and had its own original story that wasn't an anniversary title, brings it back again.
Green Hill's looking a lot more like Sand Hill right now.
I am going to commit a hate crime. And no, this is not the same thing as Kirby always using Wispy Woods or Mario always being in the Mushroom Kingdom, because unlike those games, Sonic never does anything new with it. It's always just Green Hill. So seeing it here in Frontiers, again, is just a tiny bit aggravating. This one trailer where it shows a shot of Green Hill and it immediately cuts to the title of A Wondrous New Land is so funny. Then, during Summer Games Fest, while Sega was trying to mitigate the footage that made it online after the damage that IGN's press footage did, down bad Sonic fans were literally hyper-analyzing off-screen footage of Cyberspace levels, trying to figure out if other levels like Sky Sanctuary and Chemical Plant were coming back. Which they were. Okay, so we have to reuse a lot of level themes. But you know what? That's fine. We did get this one cool new one of the futuristic highway and the floating cities, so maybe we'll get more stuff like that when the game comes out. Oh, hold on. Give me 1 second. Hello? Yeah, I was just talking about the Cyberspace levels. What's up? What do you mean there's only 4 of them? Okay. So, we have next to no new level designs. 3 out of the 4 returning ones are ones that we already saw in Generations, but the levels can still be unique. They can still be completely original and new designs that we've never seen before, right? 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 When footage first came out, people with way more time on their hands realized something. These levels that we were seeing were looking a little bit familiar. And I'm not just talking about their design aesthetics. So we have next to no new level themes. And almost every single level in Frontiers is lifted beat for beat from another game in the series. I honestly can't tell if I vehemently hate this, or I'm just too numb to care.
I get it. The cyberspace levels are not the main part of the game. Most of your time isn't spent in here, and it would be a much bigger issue if they were more of a core focus, and they can still be fun to play through. The whole point of cyberspace levels is to beat them in order to unlock vault keys, which are what allow you to actually unlock the chaos emeralds around the map, once you collect enough of them. And I actually do like how the game gives incentives to retry the levels with completing challenges to get more keys. It's a neat idea, but they're the exact same challenges for every level, being to find the red rings, get an S rank, and collect a specific amount of rings that usually feels a bit too easy. The ring count challenge is the only one that usually ends up asking you to approach the levels in a different way, and getting an S rank for a lot of levels is way too easy. There were so many times where I felt like I was goofing around taking my sweet time and still ended up getting an S rank without even trying. Everyone talks about how ridiculously hard the S rank for 1-2 is, and I really wish more of the cyberspace levels were actual challenges to complete like this one. There's only a handful of levels in the game that even get close to being as challenging as this was, which makes it even more weird as an outlier. Sonic's controls are also a little bit out of whack in cyberspace, because not only does he not have access to any of his combat abilities from the open areas, but his physics are also noticeably different, with him feeling a lot more stiff and harder to move around as. But even despite the levels still being enjoyable, they're only fun to play through because a lot of them are levels that we've played hundreds of times by now. And they're not even anywhere near as good because they all lack a visual flair that the original levels had, given that they all reuse the same 4 level themes. Like, this one level is a carbon copy of Green Hill from Generations and has the exact same parts, like when you grind across these 3 rails, but even though it's mechanically the same, you're missing so much of the sauce of what makes these levels fun, like going through the waterfall cavern and boosting away from the giant fish.
It just doesn't sit right with me that the last good Sonic game I enjoyed before this one came out when I was in middle school, and over a decade later, Sega sat me down with a straight face, tried to give me the same levels with a slightly different color of paint, and thought they could pass it off as something new.
Every time I recognized that a level layout was lifted from a specific game, I audibly groaned because it's so disappointing. The homogeny really starts to set in when after you beat the game, you unlock arcade mode, which lets you play all the cyberspace levels from a menu, and there's almost no way to differentiate any of them because they're all labeled as just 3-5 and repeat the exact same 4 level themes over and over again. At the very least, you could have named them what they were originally based off of.
I don't care if there's a lore and story explanation for it, with the cyberspace being a virtual reflection of Sonic's memories. How many times are we going to be able to justify constantly rehashing tired level themes and assets into the ground? I mean, these assets that they pulled from generations are well over 10 years old now, and they're going to start showing their age eventually. And I want to make it so clear before I get taken out of context that I am not calling the developers lazy for this. With how many reports of crunch in the industry come out virtually every other week, I don't think lazy and game developer are even 2 words that you can put together. I think the only reason why Cyberspace even turned out the way it did was because Sega just isn't giving Sonic Team enough time or resources. So they had to cobble together pre-existing level layouts with what little they had. This wouldn't be the first time that the series has suffered from rushed development pipelines, and it probably won't be the last. Regardless, while Cyberspace is incredibly disappointing, it can still be enjoyable, but they're lucky that the core of the game is good enough to make up for this.
Ultimately, the open areas, combat system, and cyberspace levels make up the central gameplay loop of Frontiers. Explore the open zones to clear challenges to upgrade Sonic, fight enemies and bosses to get portal gears to get into the cyberspace levels, and beat cyberspace levels to get vault keys to unlock the Chaos Emeralds in the open zone. I think this system does a good job at incentivizing and interacting with all the game's systems, while giving players the freedom to also choose how to engage with them. But some aspects of the progression system I also find a little bit questionable and could definitely be cleaned up. Sonic getting skill points initially gives the incentive to go out and fight enemies, but it's pretty easy to end up maxing out your skill tree really fast, and once you do, there's virtually no reason to go out and fight normal enemies anymore unless you really want to, which I find disappointing as someone who enjoys the combat a lot. It also doesn't help that even on hard mode, combat ends up feeling really easy if you're leveling up your attack and defense with the seeds that you find throughout the island. I've actually been doing a pseudo level 1 run of the game where I only level up my speed, and it makes combat more consistently enjoyable throughout the game. Playing through this makes me wish that progressing Sonic's health and defense were tied to a more traditional leveling system instead of the seeds of power and defense from clearing map challenges. Speaking of which, alongside his attack and defense, Sonic can increase his speed and ring count by collecting Cocos that are found throughout the world. Guys, we really aren't beating the Breath of the Wild allegations. Increasing your speed 1 or 2 doesn't impact you too much, but the difference over time definitely has an impact as you get to higher levels. So naturally, you're going to want to keep coming back to the Elder Cocos to keep leveling up your speed, right? Well, for some reason that I cannot begin to explain, you have to manually level up your speed and ring count in the longest animation 1 by 1, and it's not something that you can just mash through either, because the option to level up anything requires you to select what isn't the first thing that the menu's cursor is on. It literally took me 30 minutes of straight upgrading to get my speed to max, and this is so indescribably stupid because upgrading your attack and defense is so much easier. It literally works like how ranged and speed should, where you just go over to the dude, give him his stuff, he upgrades you all in one batch, and you move on with your day. I don't understand why this process is so obnoxious, and the fact that it hasn't even been patched yet is insane. Another element that's a little bit of an ick for me is how the game also lets you bypass interacting with certain parts of it. The biggest culprit behind this is also Big the Cat. Well, fishing in Frontiers is a fun distraction, and I also love how canonically Big somehow finds his way into an alternate cyber dimension on his own power and does not care outside of being able to just fish. Fishing gives you the option to purchase virtually every collectible you would need for the game. While being able to fish is tied to a resource, and the stock that Big carries is limited, it's entirely possible to use fishing as a way to skip over having to do a lot of boss fights and cyberspace levels. You obviously don't have to use him, but having the option to so easily not interact with most of the game just feels a little bit off for me.
Putting that aside though, the general gameplay loop is what builds up to the Titan fights of the islands once you collect 6 Chaos Emeralds, with the 7th one being guarded by the Titan itself. And let me tell you, as a diehard Sonic fan, these supersonic fights are some of the coolest that Sonic Team has ever done. These are amazing. First of all, this is the first time Supersonic has been relevant in years. Supersonic used to always be the showstopper big finale moment in each game, but Generations was the last time he was even part of the plot, and he hasn't been part of the main games in over a decade now. The closest thing we ever got to it was when he was a throwaway DLC in Forces that they almost made you pay money for until people hated it enough to make them not do that. I hate Forces. So I was excited to see him plot relevant again, but as I pull up to the first fight, and this song starts playing, my jaw starts to drop, and it's just look at it. There's a little thing in video games that I like to refer to as the sauce. The sauce is the perfect combination of everything I love in a video game set piece. Killer music that makes you feel like you're unstoppable. Second ingredient, crazy spectacle. And finally, gameplay that makes you feel like you're on a power trip. Put that all together, down it in one go, and you get Sonic has not done anything this cool in years. This is the exact energy that Sonic games have been missing for so long. In the Dark Era, they didn't care about pandering Sonic to the brand and playing it safe. They did whatever the heck they thought was cool and ran with it, whether people cared or not. Now, is it stupid that I, a grown adult, is getting so excited over a children's video game character going Super Saiyan and fighting to heavy metal music? Yes. Do I care? No! And the insane part is that nearly every single fight is just as fire as the first one. It's so good! Like, in the first fight, you blow a hole through this Evangelion-looking type beat Titan. And to finish off the Wyvern, you fly around this entire dragon robot across the entire island, grab him by the tail, and throw him into the side of a mountain. And bro, when Sonic picks up Knight's sword, which is like 100 times bigger than him, and uses it to slice him in half, dude, I'm sorry, it's fire. Peak fiction, raw, Kino, swag, goated. I don't know what else to call it, dude.
What I also love about these fights too is they actively fix one of the biggest nitpicks of how Supersonic fights are usually handled. Personally, I do not like when games in general have final fights that throw in a completely different gameplay style. Final bosses are supposed to be the last test of everything the player learned throughout the game up to that point. So having a final boss that doesn't play like anything else seen before never sat right with me. And this is a problem with virtually every single Supersonic fight from even the best games in the series, as they usually go for something with pure spectacle. But in Frontiers, Sonic actually uses his combat moveset from his normal gameplay, which I really appreciated. They aren't perfect, and parts of these fights can get pretty janky, like this one moment during Night Fight where you have to dodge the missiles that spawn literally out of nowhere while riding his shield. But again, the highs that I got from these fights were so good that I did not care.
And the music, oh my god! Kellyanne Quinn, who is the lead vocalist for Sleeping with Sirens, absolutely killed it on every fight theme that he worked on. All of the Titan themes are the perfect mix of insane heavy metal and the corniest lyrics I have ever heard. And I get so much life from them. Like, there is a beauty in a song like Find Your Flame having bars like, I'll turn you right into rust, grind you right into dust. You thought you were the best. Well, you haven't met us, 'cause in the end, it's you and your friends. You'll find your flame. And then having this guitar solo.
Why does he go this far? I don't know.
The music in general for Sonic has always been a really important part of the series, because even if the game itself is insufferably mediocre, there's always at least a few bangers in the soundtrack that'll make it worth it. And Frontiers not only delivers, but provides an extremely unique sound to the series that it hasn't really had before. The main themes for each of the islands are a lot more atmospheric in tone, with each having their own vibes, from Kronos Island's more melancholic piano and strings, to Ares Island's heavy use of percussion and sitars. The tracks themselves are adaptive as well, with them becoming more dynamic and impactful as you gather more Chaos Emeralds. And they actually change after each time that you get one, with some islands having 7 different versions of their respective themes. And then there's the Cyberspace music, which has some of the hardest EDM I've heard in a long time. For the past few Sonic titles, especially in Forces, you could really feel the composer Tomoyo Otani wanted to experiment with more EDM synth-based music. And opinions were actually mixed on the style that he was going for, which I can totally see, even as someone who liked most of Forces music. Not gonna lie though, that Forces synth is eternally burned into my brain, and I know that is not a good thing. But the music in Cyberspace levels feel like Otani nailed what he was trying to go for. His style developed so much more, and you can hear him working with a lot of ideas that he initially had for the tracks in Forces, with some songs having familiar melodies from that game. Including the work from other composers, each Cyberspace level has its own unique theme, which not only helps alleviate how homogenous they all feel, but provides a great wealth of fantastic music. From crazy breakcore tracks to songs with super catchy vocal samples, there's so much good stuff here.
The whiplash of vibes of the different types of music in Frontiers is honestly really funny. 1 second you could be chilling with the island theme, then you go to this, then back to that, then to this. What is tonal consistency? The disparity between the music variety and tonal consistency in Frontiers is honestly hysterical to me. It reminds me of my video output. I don't know, 1 second you're getting cat meme videos and the next it's a video essay. Maybe that's why the algorithm doesn't like me that much. I'd also like to point out that Vandalize ended up being my most played song in 2022. To no one's surprise. On the whole though, Sonic Frontiers' music is great. And some of it will easily go down as some of the best music in the history of the franchise.
Now, there's one major part of Frontiers that I still haven't talked about, and that's the game's story. I had extremely high hopes given that writer Ian Flynn, who was responsible for working on the IDW Sonic comics, was helping develop the script for the title. And while I haven't read the IDW comics myself, everyone and their mother tells me that they're goated. So one day I'll eventually go and check them out. And while I don't think Frontiers has the most exciting or eventful story in a Sonic game, the story addresses some of the biggest problems that I've had with Sonic writing for years. Not much honestly happens in the grand scope of the story outside of the beats to keep the gameplay moving. Sonic and friends get separated from each other after approaching the Starfall Islands, with Sonic repeatedly running into a new character called Sage who refuses to tell him anything about what's happening. He finds his friends who are trapped in between realities and tries to help them out, as his friends help the Coco dudes who randomly decide to uninstall themselves as they live out the past lives of the civilization that used to live on the islands, which is Okay. Definitely a plot point that caught me off guard. Sonic follows a disembodied voice that also doesn't tell him anything about what's going on, and the story kind of rinses and repeats this until the end, with doses of Eggman being stuck in cyberspace and talking to Sage as well. There's honestly not much of huge plot moments that happen outside of moving the game to the next set piece, but where the story lacks in substantial plot beats, it picks up the slack in its character writing, and even though the bar may have been 6 feet under for the past decade or so, Sonic and company actually feel like real characters for once. Sonic isn't constantly spewing quippy one-liners and actually shows more depth to his character, from his brotherly rivalry with Knuckles to him genuinely looking out for Tails and his friends even when he's at his limit, always trying to put on a good face for them. Amy, for the first time in basically forever, doesn't have her entire character revolve around her simping for Sonic, which is immensely refreshing, and the story even does some damage control for the writing of previous games by acknowledging scenarios like Tails being an absolute coward and forces for no reason, and using it to make a character arc for him where he's constantly doubting whether or not he's able to get by on his own without relying on Sonic. It's still insane to me that they had the balls to keep Forces canon after pretty much everyone hated it, and honestly, I can't tell if I'm impressed by it or not. For the longest time, Sonic stories were treated like episodic adventures where everything that happens in the game gets resetted and forgotten about by the time the next game comes along. But for the first time in the series, it feels like there's an actual interconnected story happening. Characters reference past events from nearly every game in the series, and in a lot of cases, it doesn't feel like they're doing it to be like,
Hey, do you remember that thing that happened? That one thing that we did that one time? Do you remember that?
but rather using their past experiences to help inform them of what's happening in the current story. Sage is also probably the best new characters that the series has introduced in a long time. Her coldness towards the situation, with her somewhat controlling the Titans, is fun to see Sonic try and bounce off of. With her being created by Eggman, it also helps give him someone to consistently interact with as well. Frontiers also does a lot to help flesh out and expand the world of the series as well. The Ancients, a long-since-gone civilization that created all the technology on the Starfall Islands, is actually heavily linked to the origins of the Chaos Emeralds. Turns out that the ancient civilization were a society of creatures that were the same species as Chaos from Sonic Adventure, which helps add a lot of depth to the lore of the series while providing even more questions for the future. Like, if the Ancients were the ones that made the Chaos Emeralds, who made the Master Emerald? Even though the writing was a breath of fresh air for the series, the biggest problem with the story is that a lot of it hinges on figuring out what mysterious entity wiped out the Ancients. But ultimately, that payoff doesn't go anywhere too substantial. You find out in the twist at the end that the disembodied voice that was telling Sonic what to do the whole time was actually the threat that wiped out the Ancients, and that destroying the Titans was what caused it to be freed, with Sage being the one to try and prevent that. But then when you finally get to seeing what and who it is, it's just a purple moon called the end. While I'm glad that we finally have another final boss and main villain that isn't just Eggman, we get almost no backstory for what the end actually is, outside of one vague monologue that you can barely hear over the fight itself. And it sucks, because narratively, it's almost all there. The final boss has you fighting using one of the Titans to fight against the end, using the Ancients' technology to avenge them and finish the fight that they couldn't. On paper, it's great, but it rings hollow because the end doesn't have any proper place in the story outside of being the evil thing that everyone needs to help fight. If the end as a character was able to contribute more to the themes of the story, it really could have elevated it as a whole. But as it stands right now, it just kind of feels really out of place. And the later parts of Frontiers as a whole makes it clear that for as much fun as I had with it, Frontiers is still a game that's potential was squandered by its rushed development. The game was advertised with having 5 unique islands to explore, but in reality, it's a lot more like 4.5. The 4th island, Rhea, isn't much of an island at all. You just go around and activate these towers by getting to the top of them with nothing to do or find in between. Both Oranos and Rhea aren't visually distinct from each other either, and looking at game files and trailer footage, you can tell that these and the first island were actually supposed to be one big area that eventually at some point in development got split up into 3 different islands. Rhea also just abruptly ends without a supersonic fight of its own, and while the first 3 supersonic fights fights leading up to the fourth were great, the fourth one, Supreme, feels weirdly undercooked, with attacks that should be able to be parried not working, and the whole fight feeling extremely easy. For it being one of the last big fights, it's weird how much of a pushover he is. The actual final boss of the game is also locked behind hard mode, and with every fight leading up to this being a crazy supersonic fight beforehand, you would think that they would go all out with the spectacle for this one, but instead, it's just a bullet hell? Literally the gameplay of Ikaruga verbatim. That one part I just complimented Frontiers on for having supersonic fights that actually use the game's mechanics, the final boss doesn't even do that. While this gameplay was in the game beforehand with the small hacking missions, it feels so weird and out of place to randomly decide to end the game like this, and I really don't believe that this decision was intentional.
It's blatantly obvious that the developers didn't get to do everything that they wanted to by the end of the game. Sonic Team not being given enough time by Sega is why games like 06 and Forces ended up the way they did. And unfortunately, Frontiers has signs of it too. I have no doubt that a lot of Frontiers' issues could have been remedied had the team just been given more time. Maybe we would have had more original level themes for Cyberspace, or maybe we would have had an actual final boss fight proper. Apparently the team had to fight to get another year of development time, and I'm scared to think of what this game would have ended up looking like if they hadn't had that extra time. Frontiers is not perfect. It is far from that. But despite all the issues it had, both big and small, Frontiers proves that Sonic Team still has a drive to do new, exciting things and push the series forward. They've actively made it clear that they really want Frontiers to be the base that the series builds upon for the foreseeable future. And for the first time in a long time, it feels like they could legitimately make that work. I mean, we just got word that as part of the free DLC, we're getting playable Tails, Knuckles, and Amy, which is literally going to be the first time in almost 17 years that anyone other than Sonic has been playable in a significant way, since 06 made people think that was the root of the issue. Dude, we could get Sonic Adventure 3 and have it be good. Frontiers shows that they're willing to go back to what made the series special in the first place, and push ahead to do new things as well. I think Frontiers' ending theme, One Way Dream, embodies how I feel about this game. The song features artist Nate Wants to Battle, who I've been actually following for years as one of my favorite artists, so seeing him work on an official Sonic game after doing covers for years is wild to me. But the song itself is an anthem representing Sonic Team themselves. Yes, they're not perfect, and Lord knows when they mess up bad, but they're still here. They're still trucking, and for the first time in a long time, it feels like they're on to something. And for once, it feels like Sonic fans finally got the dub that we've wanted for years now. I know some people will probably end up disagreeing with a lot of what I had to say in this video, and think that Frontiers is yet another misstep in Sonic Team's legacy of being incompetent. And who am I to tell them otherwise if they didn't have fun with the game? But for me personally though, this is the first time I've had this much fun with a Sonic game since Generations came out in 2011, and it honestly made me feel things towards a series that I haven't felt since I was a little kid. And it's because of that despite all of its numerous flaws and shortcomings, Frontiers validated my love for Sonic the Hedgehog, and I for one can't wait to see what new heights are reached because of this game.